A baton slammed into a child's skull by the son of the same officer who once brutalized her mother. 2 generations marked by the same weapon, the same silence. But when blood stained the school hallway floor, a mother swore this time the silence would break, no matter what it cost. Before we continue this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another powerful story you won't want to miss. The middle school hallway was never silent. It was alive with the chatter of students, the squeak of sneakers against polished linoleum, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights that buzzed like nervous energy overhead. But in that instant, as Jasmine Green found herself cornered, all those familiar sounds seemed to fade into the background. What cut through was the low, deliberate sound of leather against skin as Officer Scott Marrow tightened his grip on the baton holstered at his side. Jasmine was only 13, her small frame pressed against the row of beige lockers, her backpack sliding down one arm. She had done nothing more than refuse to let him search her bag without a reason. She had lifted her chin, her eyes locked on his, a stubborn defiance that should have belonged to someone twice her age. That single gesture, a refusal to bow, to make herself smaller, was enough to ignite something ugly in him. Scott Marrow stepped closer. The corridor seemed to narrow, shadows stretching unnaturally long as the afternoon sun pushed weakly through narrow windows. His voice was low, measured, meant only for her. "You think you're tougher than me, girl?" His words carried an edge that made the silence even heavier. Jasmine did not flinch. She did not speak. Her silence was not surrender, it was resistance. Then came the sound. The scrape of metal unsnapping from leather. The baton sliding free. For an instant, Jasmine hoped, it was only a threat, that he wanted her to feel fear without following through. But the look in his eyes said otherwise. The baton rose. For the briefest second, time seemed to stop. She saw the reflection of her own face in his dark, narrowed pupils, and she knew. There was no mercy there. There was no hesitation. Only the echo of something older, something that lived in his family's history, something that had broken people before her. When the baton fell, it landed with a dull, sickening crack against the side of her head. The sound was louder than it should have been, echoing down the hallway, sharp enough to slice through the empty air. And then, silence. Jasmine's body crumpled instantly, the backpack tumbling from her shoulder and hitting the floor with a hollow thud. A streak of red trailed down from her hairline, staining the pale tiles. For a moment, Scott stood there, chest heaving, his grip still tight around the weapon. The corridor was silent now, truly silent. Not a squeak of sneakers, not a whisper. Just the buzzing lights and the hollow ring of violence that lingered after the act. He lowered the baton slowly, sliding it back into place as though nothing had happened, his jaw tightening as footsteps echoed faintly from another wing of the school. He didn't look down at her again. He turned, walking away with a pace that was steady, practiced, as if he had done this before. And Jasmine lay there, still, blood seeping into the floor, her chin no longer lifted. The emergency room was always cold, the kind of cold that sank into bones and stayed there. Lorraine Green burst through the sliding glass doors, still in her fast food uniform, her shoes damp from rushing through rain, her breath ragged. The moment she saw the gurney being wheeled down the hall, her heart dropped. "Jasmine!" Her voice cracked. Desperate, but the nurses kept moving, the flurry of scrubs and latex gloves forming a wall between mother and daughter. Lorraine pushed forward, trying to reach her, but a nurse's arm blocked her path. "You need to wait here, ma'am," the nurse said firmly. The words might as well have been knives. Lorraine's chest heaved, her hands trembling as she caught sight of Jasmine's face, pale, blood crusting at her temple. Her daughter's hoodie, once bright pink, soaked through with patches of red. Doctors muttered to each other, their words fragmented but sharp enough to pierce. Possible skull fracture. Monitor swelling. She's not responsive. Each phrase slammed into Lorraine like a blow. She pressed her fists against her mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. Not here, not in front of them, not again. Because Lorraine knew this story. She had lived it before. The smell of antiseptic, the flash of harsh white light, the metallic taste of fear in her mouth. It all dragged her backward in time. "Not again," she whispered to herself, her voice cracking as she clutched at the hem of her apron. "Please God, not again." Her mind ripped open to 2009, the year her world changed forever. She remembered the cold of the pavement, her cheek pressed against it as another baton, wielded by another Moreau, came down on her, Donald Moreau, Scott's father. The name still burned like acid on her tongue. She had been younger then, angry but unbroken, her body screaming against every strike as she tried to shield herself. And she had survived, but broken. Her ribs never healed right. Her nights were haunted by the sound of leather and steel. And now it was her daughter on that table. Her daughter lying unconscious under the same violence, the same family name. Lorraine's knees buckled and she collapsed into the nearest chair, clutching Jasmine's backpack, handed to her by a nurse who didn't even realize what it meant. The straps were sticky with dried blood. The zipper was bent from the fall. Lorraine pressed it against her chest like a lifeline, rocking slightly as her eyes locked on the swinging doors that separated her from her child. In that waiting room, time stopped. The world shrank down to the rhythm of her pulse in her ears and the echo of a past that would not let her go. The flashback came not as a gentle memory but as a violent smash cut, sharper than glass. It was 2009. Lorraine was 25, standing in the street under the flickering glow of a street lamp. Donald Morrow towered above her, baton raised, his stance almost identical to the one his son would take years later. His eyes were cold, his voice nothing more than a growl as he spat words that blurred into the night air. She had lifted her arms to shield herself, but the blows came anyway, over and over, until she could no longer tell where her body ended and the pavement began. That night had stolen something from her. Not just the physical scars, the cracked rib, the limp that lingered, but something deeper. A trust in the world. A belief that she could be safe, that her body was her own. And now, in 2025, the memory merged brutally with the present. Lorraine sat in the hospital waiting room, clutching Jasmine's bloodied hoodie, and the images overlapped. Donald's baton became Scott's baton. Her broken ribs became Jasmine's fractured skull. Her silence back then became Jasmine's silence now. Inheritance. That was the word that clawed at her chest. This was not random. This was not coincidence. This was legacy. Violence passed down like heirlooms. Fathers teaching sons. Pain echoing across generations. When the doctor finally emerged, Lorraine shot to her feet, her heart pounding. His face was unreadable, but his words were precise. "She's stable for now, but the swelling is serious. We need to keep her under close watch. It's going to be a long night." Lorraine nodded numbly, barely hearing him. She followed into the room, each step heavier than the last, until she was standing at Jasmine's bedside. Her daughter looked impossibly small beneath the hospital sheets, her face pale against the harsh white pillow. An IV line ran into her arm, and machines beeped rhythmically, measuring every fragile breath. Lorraine reached out, brushing blood-matted curls away from her forehead. She bent low, her lips close to her daughter's ear. Her voice was low but steady, carrying the weight of years of silence and buried pain. "They broke me once," she whispered. Her eyes stung, but the tears did not fall. "Not yet. But they won't break you. Not while I'm alive." The words hung in the sterile air, a vow etched in stone. Lorraine pressed her forehead against Jasmine's hand, her grip firm, unyielding. In that moment, she was no longer just a mother at her child's bedside. She was a soldier on a battlefield, and this hospital room was the front line. Outside, the rain continued to fall against the windows, steady and relentless, as if the world itself knew that something had been set in motion, something that could no longer be stopped. Lorraine sat at the dining room table long after midnight, the only light in the house coming from a single desk lamp that cast everything in sharp contrast. The hospital smell still clung to her uniform, but she had not changed. She couldn't. The moment she closed her eyes, the images collided. On her laptop screen, frozen frames stared back at her. Grainy surveillance footage from 2009, the night she was beaten, next to the newly leaked footage of Jasmine in the hallway, crumpling under the baton strike. The overlap was impossible to ignore. The angle of the baton, the stance, the set of the jaw, identical. Father and son, mirror images across decades. Lorraine leaned closer, her finger trembling as she tapped between the two frames. The past and present collapsed into one another. Donald Marrow in 2009, Scott Marrow in 2023. Same bloodline, same weapon, same violence. Her chest tightened. It was no longer just about her pain, or Jasmine's. This was about something larger. An inheritance no one asked for, passed down like property, like a baton handed from one hand to the next. The thought made her stomach twist. She opened a new file on her laptop, her fingers moving with purpose even as her body shook. The header read, "Timeline of Eraser." It wasn't just Jasmine's story. It wasn't just her story. It was a pattern, decades long, buried under reports, redactions, and deliberate silence. On her desk sat stacks of photocopied suspension records, names crossed out with thick black ink, newspaper clippings of unexplained deaths, faded case files rescued from the trash. Lorraine spread them out, her kitchen table vanishing under paper. She clipped, highlighted, drew arrows that connected faces and names like threads in a web. Each connection was a strike, each file a wound. Her whisper was steady now, words she repeated as her mantra, anchoring her in the work. When justice isn't inherited, evil takes its place. She had lived it. Jasmine was living it now, and if she did nothing, another child, another mother, would live it tomorrow. She flipped through a stack of papers until she found one photograph. A boy, no older than Jasmine, his school picture tucked into an article about his sudden suspension. No charges, no explanation. The boy had vanished from the school system a month later, his name never spoken again. Lorraine placed his photo beside Jasmine's, the two children staring at her from the table. Their eyes demanded action. Lorraine pressed her palms flat against the papers, her breathing ragged. It was no longer just about evidence. It was about memory. About building a record that could not be erased. She would not let their stories disappear. Not again. The work consumed her. Night after night, Lorraine pieced together fragments, the 312-page dossier growing heavier with each new edition. It was not a neat record. It was jagged, stitched together from hidden files and whispered accounts. But in its chaos lay the truth. She labeled each section with precision. Erased suspensions, deaths in custody, transfers without records. Each file had a story behind it, and Lorraine carried every single one like it was her own blood. One file told of a girl expelled for insubordination. No record of her hearing existed. Another recounted a teacher who tried to report Scott Moreau for excessive force, but later resigned under pressure, his complaint vanishing from the archives. Another spoke of a boy beaten so badly in detention he had permanent hearing loss, yet the file listed it as injury from fall. Lorraine paused at one report, her eyes tracing the words, subject, Green, Lorraine. Her own file, from 2009. The language was sterile, detached, almost mocking. Incident resulted in minor injury, subject resisted officer commands. She slammed the paper against the table, her hands shaking. Minor injury. As if broken ribs and sleepless nights could be reduced to two words. She closed her eyes and steadied herself. She had no room for despair. Every file, every record she uncovered was another stone in the foundation she was building. The timeline of Eraser wasn't just paperwork. It was a weapon, and she intended to wield it. Her printer whirred through the night, spitting out page after page until the stack grew taller than her forearm. She organized them into binders, slipped photographs into protective sleeves, and highlighted key phrases. The weight of the dossier was physical. When she lifted it, her arms strained. On the final page, she placed a photo of Jasmine lying in the hospital bed, her face pale, the bruise swelling across her temple. That image was not just an ending, it was the culmination of generations of erasure. She sealed it in plastic, the cover page for all to see. When she closed the binder, she whispered again, her voice a low vow, "When justice isn't inherited, evil takes its place." Lorraine stood, her legs stiff, and walked to the corner of the room where a plain black box sat waiting. She placed the dossier inside, along with copies of audio files, photographs, and sworn statements. She locked it with a click, her hands steady for the first time in days. The black box sat like a tomb on her table, but inside it lived something else entirely: evidence, memory, truth. The next morning, Lorraine walked into the post office, her grip firm on the handle of the black box. The air was thick with the smell of paper and dust, the hum of conversations about packages and stamps. But in her mind, it was silent. She slid the box across the counter. "Overnight delivery," she said, her voice even. The clerk nodded, stamped the receipt, and asked no questions. Lorraine didn't need to add commentary. She didn't need to write a cover letter full of pleas. The dossier spoke for itself. The Oversight Commission would open the box, see Jasmine's face staring back at them on the cover page, and know. The silence of decades had been broken. At the same time, outside the walls of bureaucracy, another spark ignited. Students from Jasmine's school began whispering the truth. A short video clip leaked online, just a few seconds of grainy footage showing Jasmine collapsing in the hallway. It spread like wildfire. Within hours, social media carried a new tag: erased by policy. It wasn't just a hashtag, it was a declaration. Students printed it on signs, taped them to fences, scribbled it across notebooks. Parents muttered it under their breath at school board meetings. Teachers exchanged glances as whispers grew louder. At the entrance of Jasmine's school, hand-painted signs appeared overnight, hung on the iron fence. "We will not be erased. Justice for Jasmine. End the inheritance of violence." The signs multiplied until the fence looked less like a barrier and more like a memorial. Lorraine drove past one morning, her chest tightening at the sight. She hadn't organized it. She hadn't told anyone what to do. But people were moving anyway. Parents were telling each other, "If Lorraine can fight, so can we." The movement was no longer confined to her kitchen table or her sleepless nights. It was in the streets, in the schools, in the voices of children who refused to be silent. Lorraine parked her car and stepped out, walking toward the fence. She ran her fingers across one of the signs, the paint still damp from the morning dew. Her daughter's name, written in bold red letters, glared back at her. She closed her eyes and breathed. The fear was still there, the pain still raw, but something else had taken root. Hope. Not the fragile kind that faded with the night, but the kind born from action, from defiance. She looked back at the school, its windows lined with faces peeking out, watching her. She raised her hand in a small wave, and the children waved back. The spark had caught, the silence had ended, and the world was finally listening. The courtroom was packed to the walls, the hum of whispers swelling like a storm waiting to break. Reporters filled every bench, their cameras balanced on knees, lenses pointed toward the front where Scott Merrow sat stiff, his hands folded, his jaw locked. Lorraine was there too, her eyes hollow but burning, her daughter Jasmine seated beside her in a wheelchair, a thin band still wrapped around her temple. The judge called the room to order, but silence was fragile, stretched thin as glass. Scott's attorney shifted in his seat, glancing at his client. But Scott seemed restless, impatient, as though some burden pressed against his ribs, demanding release. The prosecutor laid out the charges: assault, excessive force, abuse of authority. Each word struck like a hammer. But when Scott rose to speak, the room froze, sensing something unexpected. He leaned toward the microphone, his voice steady at first, but jagged with something close to bitterness. "I didn't hit her because she was black," he said, and a ripple of gasps tore through the courtroom. He paused, his eyes darting across the faces, then settling for a moment on Jasmine, who refused to flinch. His next words fell heavier than the first. "I hit her because she looked at me the way her mother did, like I wasn't in control, like I didn't matter." The silence that followed was suffocating. Lorraine's hand shot to her mouth, the memory of her own beating slamming back with force. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked, but no one spoke. The courtroom seemed to tilt, as though every brick had shifted under the weight of his words. The prosecutor's voice cut in, sharp, incredulous. "So you admit you recognized her mother in her? You admit this wasn't discipline, it was personal vengeance?" Scott's face twisted, torn between defiance and resignation. "She looked at me with the same eyes, the same defiance, like I was nothing." I snapped. "Maybe that makes me guilty, but I won't let anyone say I did it just because of race. I did it because she reminded me of the moment my father lost everything to people like her mother." The gasps came again, sharper, harsher, the weight of his confession filling the air like smoke. Jasmine gripped her chair arms, her body trembling, but her chin lifted in that same silent defiance. Lorraine sat rigid, her breath shallow, but inside, something steadier than rage began to form. It was not just her fight anymore. It was his confession, spoken in public, an admission that violence was an inheritance willingly embraced. The judge struck his gavel, demanding order, but the room was already alive with tension, the truth bleeding into the open. What Scott thought was a defense had become an indictment, not only of himself, but of his bloodline, of the system that had sheltered him. And somewhere in the crowd, a child's small hand clutched a toy baton, waiting to rise. The testimony dragged on, but no one could unhear the words Scott had spoken. The courtroom buzzed with energy, the air charged with disbelief and fury. When recess was called, people spilled into the hallway, reporters shouting into microphones, repeating the line again and again. "I didn't hit her because she was black. I hit her because she looked at me like her mother did." It became a headline before the gavel even cooled. When the session resumed, the tension had shifted. Every word hung heavier, every silence louder. It was then that it happened. Something no one had planned, something no one could have staged. As Scott sat back down, a small boy in the gallery stood on the bench. He couldn't have been older than 9, his shoes barely reaching the edge. In his hand was a plastic toy baton, the kind sold in discount bins with police costumes. He raised it above his head, his voice carrying over the stunned courtroom. "Want to hit me too?" Gasps tore through the chamber. Some clapped hands over mouths. Others sat frozen, their eyes flicking between the child and the officer on trial. The boy's question sliced through the silence with more force than any lawyer's argument. Scott's face drained of color. For the first time since his arrest, he looked unsettled, as though the child's words had pierced armor no judge, no attorney could touch. The cameras flashed wildly, capturing the moment, the baton raised, like a mirror reflecting everything wrong with the scene before them. The bailiff moved forward, unsure if he should remove the boy, but the judge raised a hand, signaling to let him be. The silence stretched, the image cementing itself into the minds of everyone present. The boy lowered the baton slowly, sliding back down beside his mother. But the damage was done. The question lingered in the air, unanswered, unanswerable. Lorraine's eyes filled, her chest aching, Not only for her daughter, but for that boy, for every child who had learned too soon that even in a courtroom they were not safe from inherited violence. She leaned closer to Jasmine, whispering, "You see, they're not afraid anymore." Jasmine squeezed her hand weakly, her eyes steady, her jaw firm. When the cameras broadcast the scene, it ignited something far beyond the courtroom. By evening, the clip was everywhere. News channels, social media feeds, projected onto buildings and downtown protests. The question echoed like a chorus. "Want to hit me too?" Signs appeared overnight, painted by trembling hands but held high by thousands. Children carried toy batons into marches, raising them like flags of defiance. Teachers walked out of classrooms with banners declaring, "Protect our children, not your power." Scott had confessed. The boy had confronted. The silence was no longer safe. Every corner of the city now knew that what had once been whispered was undeniable, visible, and devastatingly clear. The trial continued, but momentum shifted again when Lorraine herself was called to speak. She rose from her bench, her steps deliberate, her presence commanding, even as grief shadowed her face. When she reached the witness stand, the courtroom stilled. The prosecutor asked her to recount 2009. Lorraine's voice did not tremble. She spoke of the baton, of the way Donald Morrow had looked at her, of the ribs that broke and the silence that followed. Her words cut like blades, not dressed in legal language but in raw memory. When asked what she thought of Scott's claim, Lorraine leaned toward the microphone, her eyes locking onto his across the room. "Good," she said, her voice low but clear. "Then I'll go back too, and this time I won't be in handcuffs." The courtroom erupted, the words echoing like a thunderclap. Reporters scrambled, typing, recording, sending her quote into the world within seconds. By nightfall, her defiance had spread across every screen, her face framed with the words, "I won't be in handcuffs." Students began repeating it in protests, their voices unified. Parents wore it on shirts. Online, the phrase became a banner under which stories poured in, accounts of other parents, other children, erased and silenced, now refusing to bow. Lorraine's vow had become theirs. But the weight of confession and defiance was not done unraveling. The prosecutor brought forward new evidence, letters signed by Principal Halpern himself, authorizing quiet transfers of students whose complaints threatened order. Each letter bore his name, his signature, his complicity. Halpern sat stiff in the witness chair, his once proud shoulders sagging as the letters were read aloud. One by one, they painted a picture of willful blindness, of a man who had thought silence was safety. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. "I thought I was protecting order," he murmured, his eyes darting between Lorraine, Jasmine, and the crowd. "I thought if we contained it, it would stop." The room grew heavy, but Lorraine leaned forward, her gaze unflinching. "Order," she repeated. "You called it order when children vanished from your classrooms, when teachers left in silence, when my daughter was broken under your roof? That wasn't order, that was complicity." Halpern's hands shook, his words faltered. I thought it was the only way." But the courtroom no longer listened to excuses. The cameras caught every tear, every tremor in his voice. His legacy was dissolving before the eyes of the nation. By the time the gavel struck again, the trial was no longer just about Scott Morrow. It was about a lineage of silence, about administrators and officers bound by the same inheritance of violence, exposed at last. Lorraine's words, the boy's question, Scott's confession, all of it had converged into a storm that no system could contain. Outside, crowds chanted under the courthouse windows, "We won't be erased. We won't be in handcuffs. Want to hit me too?" Their voices rose like thunder, echoing into the night. The confession was no longer just testimony. It was the breaking of chains. And in that moment, Lorraine knew that what had begun with a baton in a hallway had become something unstoppable. The trial had rattled the city, but Lorraine understood that courtrooms were not the only place where memory needed to live. Legal proceedings could be dragged out, manipulated, delayed until people lost interest. She knew institutions survived by exhausting their critics, by letting outrage fade with time. So while lawyers filed motions and judges read statements, she turned her attention to something more lasting, building a space that the system could not silence. At the heart of the school where Jasmine had been attacked, Lorraine began transforming a long corridor into something unforgettable. The custodians whispered about her request, confused but cooperative. Students passing by watched as rolls of heavy material were brought in, the smell of paint and sawdust filling the air. What emerged over several weeks was a 12-foot wall that reached from floor to ceiling, stretching across the school's central hallway. It was not just a barrier of stone and steel, but a living installation. Across its surface, Lorraine placed digital screens, each programmed to cycle through hundreds of names. These were not random. They were the names of students who had been erased, detained, suspended, or quietly disappeared from school records after incidents with officers or administrators. The wall pulsed with their stories, their identities refusing to vanish. At its center was Jasmine's photograph. Her eyes, determined and unyielding, looked out at every passerby. On opening day, Lorraine gathered students in the hall. Teachers stood awkwardly at the edges, unsure of what to expect. Jasmine wheeled herself to the front, her head held high despite the bandages still faintly visible on her skin. Lorraine spoke in a voice firm but heavy with the weight of years. They tried to erase our children by hiding their names in locked files. They thought if no one remembered, then no one would resist. Today, that ends. Their names live here. The screens flickered, glowing with the first set of names. Some students gasped when they recognized cousins, siblings, or old classmates they hadn't seen in years. One girl whispered, "That's my brother." Another boy touched the wall softly, his finger following the letters of his cousin's name. And then, silence gave way to murmurs. The installation had done what Lorraine hoped. It forced recognition. The hidden became visible. The silenced restored to presence. This was not a courtroom argument. It was proof, etched into light and stone, undeniable and relentless. Lorraine stepped forward once more. When justice isn't inherited, evil takes its place. But memory is stronger. We will not let them vanish us again. The words settled into the room like a promise carved into steel. From that day, students called it something simple, something unforgettable, the Hall of Justice. The Hall of Justice did not stop with names. Lorraine knew symbols mattered, that children remembered what they could see and touch. One morning, when the hall was still empty, she returned carrying a small wooden box. Inside was a shattered police badge, bent down the middle, its numbers scraped away but faintly legible. It was the badge of the officer who had attacked Jasmine, broken in the struggle, retrieved from evidence as if it were trash. She took a hammer and nails from her bag. No ceremony, no speeches. She lifted the badge, positioned it beneath Jasmine's photograph at the center of the wall, and struck it into place. Each clang of the hammer echoed through the hallway. When she finished, the broken badge sat crooked, pinned like a scar that refused to heal. Later that day, students gathered around it, whispering. "That's it? The one they used on her?" one asked, his eyes wide. Another girl answered, "Yeah, it's proof they're not untouchable." Soon they gave the space its own name, the Broken Badge Corner. It became a place where students lingered between classes, their fingers brushing the cold metal, as though contact with it connected them to something deeper than themselves. Parents began to visit. Some came quietly at night after work, standing in front of the wall as if in prayer. Others brought flowers, leaving them beneath the badge. A small pile of candles grew, each flame a silent protest. Notes began appearing too, folded paper wedged into cracks in the wall. Apologies, confessions, promises to fight harder. For my son, who they said was a problem. for my daughter who never came home from detention. Soon the hall transformed into a pilgrimage. Neighbors who had no children at the school came to see it, to whisper the names out loud. Families traveled from other districts, sometimes driving hours, just to stand in front of the glowing wall and read. The sound of footsteps grew constant, echoing through the school, even on weekends, as if the installation had become more than a memorial. It was a gathering ground, a place where silence no longer ruled. The district tried to minimize its impact, claiming it was only temporary, but it was too late. Photos of the wall spread across social media, thousands of shares marking it as a landmark of resistance. The broken badge corner appeared in news broadcasts, parents interviewed as they placed flowers. To the system, it was an embarrassment. To the people, it was proof that history was no longer under lock and key. Lorraine had created something no one could walk past without feeling its weight. Children now entered their classrooms with their eyes sharpened, their voices louder. Teachers hesitated before enforcing rules they once carried out without question. The wall was not passive, it was changing behavior, changing memory itself. And Lorraine knew that was why the system would soon strike back. The backlash came quickly. Within weeks, the school board convened in a closed meeting. Papers were shuffled, voices raised, legal opinions offered about property rights and liability. By the end of the session, a demand had been issued. The wall must come down. The district claimed it violated educational neutrality and created a climate of hostility. To the people in charge, memory was dangerous. They summoned Lorraine to a board meeting, cameras ready, microphones angled toward her. Members sat at a long, polished table, their suits stiff, their voices rehearsed. "Mrs. Turner," the chairman began, his tone brittle, "while we understand your intent, the Hall of Justice is inappropriate for a learning environment. It divides rather than unites. It must be dismantled immediately." Lorraine stood before them, her hands steady at her sides. She glanced briefly at the cameras, then back at the board. "You call it division," she said, evenly. "I call it truth. You want classrooms filled with silence, not memory. But silence is what brought us here. Silence is why my daughter lies scarred." The chairman leaned forward, irritation breaking through his composure. "We are asking for cooperation. This isn't about silencing memory, it's about maintaining order." Lorraine's voice sharpened, carrying into every microphone. "If you want to dismantle the wall, you'll have to dismantle the memory. And memory doesn't break when you order it to. It grows. It spreads. Tear down the stone, and the names will live on every corner, in every classroom, in every home. You can't erase us anymore." The room fell silent. Even the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their arguments wilting under her words. Outside, dozens of parents and students stood with signs pressed against the glass. "The wall stays. We are not erased." Their voices rose, chanting in rhythm, shaking the walls of the boardroom itself. The meeting adjourned without a resolution. But Lorraine knew the system would not let it rest. They would send lawyers, administrators, officials with sharpened pens and cold voices. Yet each attempt would only feed the fire. Every threat to dismantle the wall brought more visitors, more flowers, more candles. At night, when the hall was quiet, Lorraine sometimes walked its length alone. She would touch Jasmine's photograph, then let her hand fall to the broken badge beneath it. The cold metal seemed to hum with everything it represented: the brutality, the defiance, the refusal to forget. She would whisper softly, not just to Jasmine, but to every name glowing on the screen. "They can't silence you now. Not anymore." The Hall of Justice had become more than a memorial. It was a battleground, but also a sanctuary, and Lorraine understood that by building it, she had shifted the struggle from the courtroom to the hearts of families, the halls of schools, the very places where children learned who they were. The system panicked, the people gathered, and in that tension, a movement stronger than fear was being born. The Hall of Justice had struck a nerve that no one could ignore. What began as a wall in one school now rippled outward, pressing every authority to answer questions they had long buried. The district tried to dismiss it as performance art, but pressure mounted from the community and from reporters who refused to let it fade. Soon, the State Oversight Committee announced the formation of an independent investigation. Its mandate was blunt: examine every file, every record, every suspension that had disappeared into silence. The investigators arrived with boxes of equipment, combing through file rooms that administrators thought had been forgotten. Cabinets groaned open, dusty folders spilling onto tables. What the oversight team uncovered was worse than even Lorraine expected. Surveillance tapes from school hallways had been erased within hours of student detentions. Dozens of suspension files were marked with initials that no one could identify. Attendance logs had been altered, replacing names with blanks. When questioned, administrators stammered, claiming clerical errors, but the volume of falsification was impossible to dismiss. One investigator, a woman with a tired face and sharp eyes, held up a spreadsheet she had unearthed. Across its top were columns labeled with cold precision: behavioral infractions, suspension eligibility, detention projection, and in the far right column, the words chilled every parent in the room. Target demographics. Rows of data revealed patterns: disproportionate numbers of black students, names coded into systems that funneled them toward discipline at every turn. It was not accidental, it was design. The public hearings grew crowded. Parents gasped as documents were projected on large screens, their children's names appearing in files they had never been told existed. One father stood trembling as he recognized his daughter's handwriting on a confession document that had been forged. Another mother wept openly when she saw a surveillance log listing her son as removed for non-compliance, even though he had been in the hospital the day the incident was recorded. The oversight team issued a preliminary statement. This is not negligence, this is systemic design. Their words fell like thunder. It was no longer about one officer's violence, no longer about one school's silence. It was a network of complicity, woven into policy and enforced with cold calculation. Lorraine sat in the back of the hearing, Jasmine's hand in hers. She whispered, "See? They thought we were alone, but the truth is too big to bury." Jasmine nodded, her eyes fixed on the screen where names scrolled endlessly. For the first time, she felt the system being forced to look at itself. And what it saw was rot. As the investigations tore open hidden files, another voice emerged. The teachers. Many had long remained quiet, choosing comfort over confrontation. But the Hall of Justice had changed the air in the city. It was no longer possible to stand in silence without being noticed. And so, one by one, teachers began stepping forward. At a televised forum, a retired teacher with silver hair and a trembling voice held the microphone tightly. "I ignored what I saw," she admitted. "I signed off on suspensions I knew were wrong. I thought silence kept me safe. I was wrong. Silence made me complicit." Her words struck the audience with force. Another teacher followed, younger, her voice breaking as she recalled sending a child out of class for disruption. "I knew he wasn't disruptive. He was hungry. He was tired. But the paperwork demanded I call security, and I did. I regret it every day." One after another, they confessed, not to crimes in the legal sense, but to moral failures that had allowed the system to grow unchecked. Some spoke of meetings where administrators pressured them to document everything, to build cases against students. Others admitted they had been warned not to question why certain children disappeared after confrontations with officers. The community listened with a mix of rage and reluctant compassion. Parents shouted at some, accusing them of cowardice, while others wept, realizing that even the teachers had been trapped in a machine larger than themselves. Yet every confession peeled away another layer of the mask, exposing a culture that had operated under the guise of discipline while feeding an unspoken agenda. The moment that shook the city most came when a former principal appeared unexpectedly at a hearing. He looked pale, carrying a small box of files he had kept hidden. Placing them on the table, he said, "These are the ones they told me to shred. I couldn't do it." Inside were letters from students, their pleas written in childish scrawl. "Please don't suspend me. I didn't do it. I want to come back. I promise I'll be good." The sight of those letters broke something in the room. Reporters dropped their pens. Parents sobbed aloud. The system was no longer abstract. It was visible, tangible, and undeniable. Teachers who once feared speaking out now lined up, waiting their turn at the microphone. Some begged forgiveness. Some demanded punishment for themselves. But all agreed on one thing: silence had been the true accomplice. Lorraine, standing near the back, whispered again to Jasmine, "This is the sound of walls falling." While the oversight hearings and teacher confessions consumed the city, another confrontation was brewing. This one was not in a courtroom or a classroom, but on live television. Donald Morrow, once a respected figure in the community and father of the disgraced Officer Scott, agreed to an interview that everyone expected would be a defense of his son. Instead, it became the sharpest blade in the unraveling of authority. The cameras lit up. The interviewer posed the question carefully. "Mr. Morrow, do you believe your son was treated unfairly?" Donald's face tightened. For a moment it seemed he might defend the family name. But then he inhaled deeply and said, "No, my son is guilty, not only of what he did to that girl, but of what he inherited from me." The interviewer blinked in surprise. Donald continued, his voice heavy but clear. "He inherited the violence, not the mask. I taught him discipline. I taught him control. But beneath it all, I carried the same rage, the same contempt, passed down like an heirloom. He acted without the mask I wore, and for that, we both stand condemned." The studio fell silent. Across the city, viewers sat frozen. This was not the narrative anyone expected. A father dismantling his son, dismantling himself, on live television. Donald's words rippled through social media instantly. Clips replayed millions of times. Some praised him for honesty. Others accused him of betrayal. But no one could deny the gravity of what he had confessed. For Scott, the humiliation was unbearable. Already ostracized, already despised, he found himself stripped even of his father's reluctant defense. His last fragile shield had shattered. Days later, he attempted something mundane, grocery shopping. Hood pulled low, shoulders hunched, he pushed a cart quietly down the aisles. At first, no one noticed, but then a woman recognized him. She did not shout, did not curse, she simply fell silent, her eyes fixed on him. One by one, others noticed. The silence spread like a tide. Conversations halted, cash registers clicked to a stop. Within minutes, the entire store was quiet, every eye resting on Scott Morrow. He froze, clutching the handle of his cart. The silence pressed down heavier than any insult could have. No one yelled, no one touched him. They simply refused him the humanity of acknowledgement. His hands trembled. He abandoned the cart, milk, bread, fruit left behind, and walked quickly out the door. Behind him the silence lingered, unbroken until he was gone. That moment, though small, became symbolic. A man once shielded by authority, by a badge, by a system built to protect him, now exiled by silence. It was not the court's sentence that defined his fall, but the community's refusal to grant him space among them. His authority had collapsed, not with noise, but with the absence of it. Lorraine heard the story later that evening. She looked at Jasmine and said quietly, "Sometimes the loudest justice is silence." Jasmine nodded, knowing that in the quiet, power had shifted. The collapse of authority was complete, and the city was learning to breathe a new kind of air. The invitation had arrived quietly, tucked into an envelope with no fanfare, but the meaning behind it was unmistakable. Lorraine had been chosen to receive a state-level civil rights honor, a recognition typically reserved for politicians, decorated attorneys, or leaders who had spent decades shaping policy. For some, this was a crowning achievement, a sign they had crossed into history. But for Lorraine, it was a strange, almost unwelcome spotlight. She was not a senator, not a judge. She was simply a mother who had refused to be quiet. On the night of the ceremony, she did not dress in the gowns others wore. She appeared in her everyday winter coat, the same one she wore on school nights when she stood outside waiting for Jasmine. Her hair was unstyled, pulled back simply, and her shoes were worn at the edges. When she walked onto the stage, murmurs rippled through the hall. Reporters leaned in, cameras flashing, as though waiting for her to stumble. But Lorraine stood steady, her voice carrying in the hushed room. "I need you to understand something before I accept this," she began. "I'm not a good person. I'm not here to make you feel safe about the world again. I'm your consequence." The words dropped like stones into water. People blinked, stunned, as if they had misheard her. She continued, her voice sharpening, cutting through the hall's polished air. "For years, you thought silence would protect you. You thought that if you looked away, the harm wouldn't find your home, your children. But silence doesn't protect, it invites. And so, I'm not standing here as your proof that good people win. I'm standing here as the cost of your silence. My daughter paid that price, and now, so will you." Some in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward, caught in the gravity of her presence. Lorraine did not soften her tone. "Do not clap for me. Do not place me in your books as the hero who rose from tragedy. I don't need your applause, and I will not be your decoration. I'm here to remind you that justice doesn't arrive gently. It arrives when those ignored finally refuse to kneel." The hall was silent, except for the sound of cameras capturing every word. Lorraine's unstyled hair, her plain coat, her unshaken resolve, all of it carved into the memory of everyone present. For the first time, the audience wasn't looking at a honoree. They were looking at judgment made flesh, spoken by a woman who had lost too much to let the room breathe easy. The moment that sealed Lorraine's words into the public's consciousness came unexpectedly. In the middle of her address, she paused, looked directly into the cameras and said, "I don't need to be your hero. I just need my daughter to never be taught how to kneel." That single sentence broke past the hall and into the bloodstream of the internet. Within hours, clips of Lorraine standing in her plain coat, her voice steady but trembling with rage and clarity, flooded social media. Commentators replayed the line again and again. Some called it the defining statement of a generation. Others attacked it, accusing her of disrespect toward authority. But no one ignored it. At schools across the state, children repeated it in hallways. On college campuses, it became a rallying cry, painted on banners and held above heads during marches. Musicians sampled her words into songs, their beats pulsing through headphones on subways and sidewalks. Even late-night hosts, usually distanced from politics, recited the line as the audience roared in recognition. For Jasmine, watching from home, it was surreal. She had seen her mother cry in kitchens, clutch her hands in waiting rooms, whisper prayers in the dark. Now she saw her mother's face on every screen, her words echoing across the nation. "I don't need to be your hero. I just need my daughter to never be taught how to kneel." Jasmine whispered the line back to herself, holding it like armor. But with the virality came the weight of expectation. Journalists filled Lorraine's voicemail with requests for interviews. Politicians, sensing opportunity, began framing themselves alongside her message. And most persistently, committees began approaching her with proposals to run for office. They saw in her the raw energy of a movement, the perfect figure to channel anger into electoral power. At first, Lorraine ignored them, but as the invitations multiplied, she addressed them directly during a second appearance. Standing at a community meeting in a modest church hall, she said, "I keep hearing that I should run for office. Let me be clear, I'm not here to win chairs. I'm here to flip tables." The crowd erupted in cheers. It was not a politician's polished soundbite. It was a mother's defiance, sharpened into political refusal. Lorraine's rejection of the system became, paradoxically, her most political act. By refusing their offers, she made it clear she could not be contained by their structures. She had no interest in becoming another figure lost in the machinery of government. Her power was in disruption, in consequence. Everywhere she went, people repeated it back. Not here to win chairs, here to flip tables. The phrase painted murals, appeared on shirts, and even scrawled across courthouse steps. Lorraine had not intended to lead a campaign, but unknowingly she had ignited a movement beyond herself. When the civil rights honor was formally bestowed upon her, the organizers presented Lorraine with a framed certificate, a medal, and a monetary award meant to symbolize investment in her cause. But Lorraine had planned something they did not anticipate. Standing at the podium, she lifted the award envelope and said, "This money will not sit with me. It belongs to those who paid the cost." She turned, and with deliberate steps, placed the envelope in a box labeled with the names of suspended students from the district. The audience gasped as she bent down, slid the box across the stage, and said, "This is not a gift, it's a refund." Her words reverberated in the hall. Every suspension, every detention, every hour stolen from our children was theft. This money is not charity. It's the smallest fraction of what was stolen from them. Let this be the start of repayment, not the end. Parents in the audience cried openly. Some rose to their feet, clapping not in celebration but in solidarity. Others simply covered their mouths, stunned by the audacity of her gesture. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashing as they captured the moment that would headline every newspaper the next morning. Later, when asked why she gave away the award, Lorraine explained quietly, "I don't want their medals. I don't want their applause. I want the system to feel what it feels like to lose something." Her answer only deepened the respect and controversy surrounding her. Some politicians condemned her act as ungrateful, while activists hailed it as the clearest expression of justice they had ever seen. In the days that followed, suspended students and their families gathered to receive the funds. They used it for groceries, rent, and tuition. A boy stood up during one gathering, holding the envelope tightly, and said, "I thought nobody saw me. Now I know somebody did." Lorraine watched silently as children and parents held on to what she had passed forward. For her, it was not about the money. It was about rebalancing the ledger, however slightly. It was about showing the community that justice could not simply be spoken, it had to be redistributed, restored, rebuilt. That night, as she sat with Jasmine, the two of them ate quietly at their kitchen table. No cameras, no crowds, no applause. Just mother and daughter, shoulders touching, plates of food between them. Jasmine whispered, "Mom, you flipped the table." Lorraine smiled faintly, brushing Jasmine's hair back. "And I'll keep flipping them until they can't be set the same way again." The speech of consequence had ended, but its echoes traveled far beyond the hall. It was no longer about one award, one speech, or one act of defiance. It was about a shift in the balance of power, about a mother refusing to be anyone's hero while becoming the consequence that the system could no longer ignore. Lorraine sat at her kitchen table one night, papers scattered around her, the glow of a small lamp casting long shadows on the wall. She had been receiving letters, some of them supportive, some hateful, many from parents who had once stayed silent but now admitted they could no longer look away. But Lorraine decided it was time to write one of her own. She picked up her pen and addressed it directly to the police department. Not as an apology, not as a plea, but as a statement. She began with a line that came to her like thunder. "Silence, when it stands between a child and a baton, is not neutrality, it's permission." She let the words hang on the page for a moment, then continued, "Every time you swing, every time you detain, every time you stamp a file with the word disruptive, know that you do not act alone. You are backed by the silence of those who say nothing. That silence is your shield. That silence is what makes you believe you can go home at night without consequence. But I am here to remind you, silence will no longer protect you." The letter went on for 3 pages, not a single word wasted. Lorraine called out the falsified reports, the erasure of surveillance footage, the targeting of children by demographics. She wrote about the badge nailed beneath Jasmine's picture in the school, how the rusting metal was now more honest than the officers who had once worn it. She closed the letter with a final sentence that felt like a verdict. "You will not remember me as the mother who lost her daughter. You will remember me as the mother who refused to lose her voice." She mailed it to the department, but also posted it online. Within hours, it was everywhere. The line about silence not being neutrality spread like wildfire. Students quoted it on their feeds, journalists read it on air, activists painted it on protest signs. For many, it was the clearest articulation of what they had felt but never put into words. Neutrality was dead. Silence had been exposed for what it truly was: permission for violence. At the school, a physical symbol of resistance began to change. The broken badge Lorraine had nailed under Jasmine's photo had been moved outside by students who wanted the world to see it. They mounted it on a wooden post at the edge of the schoolyard where everyone passed each morning. At first, the metal still gleamed faintly in the sunlight, though the cracks across its surface were visible. But as days turned into weeks, the rain began each storm stained it a darker shade, each droplet of water carrying away pieces of its shine. Slowly, the badge corroded into a green rust, its once authoritative glint transformed into something frail, fragile, defeated. Students started calling it the rusting truth. Some would stop on their way into class and run their fingers across it, leaving streaks of brown and green on their fingertips. One boy said quietly, "It looks more real this way, honest." Teachers walked past it too, some with bowed heads, others standing silently before it as if in confession. The badge had become more than metal. It had become testimony. The slow decay of a symbol that once terrified now stood as proof of its own dishonor. From that image, another wave of expression began. Students designed T-shirts with slogans that carried their own resistance. The most popular read, "A bad day shouldn't end a life." It was printed in bold white letters on black fabric, worn by teenagers who had grown tired of being treated like suspects. Within a month, entire hallways were filled with students wearing the shirts, walking past teachers who could not ignore the silent message stretched across their chests. Teachers, too, began finding their voices. At the end of the year, when one beloved teacher announced his resignation, he left his class with a parting note written on the chalkboard. "If you're afraid of students who think you're in the wrong profession." The words stayed there long after he was gone. No one dared erase it. Students took photos, shared them online, and the sentence spread, reaching far beyond the town. Teachers across the state adopted it as a motto, painting it on banners at rallies and even writing it into resignation letters of their own. The system had tried to silence classrooms. Instead, classrooms had become pulpits. Resistance was no longer only in speeches or protests. It was in the daily rituals of school life, in the quiet but steady defiance of children refusing to bow. The final blow of that season of resistance came in the form of a mural. It began as a whisper between students, then sketches on notebook paper, then late-night gatherings in the gym with brushes and paint cans. The principal tried to stop it at first, but the momentum was too strong. By the time he walked into the gym to confront them, the wall was already half covered in color. He froze, realizing he could not erase what had already begun. When it was finished, the mural stretched across the entire gym wall. It depicted faceless silhouettes, students, teachers, neighbors, all standing in the shadows of towering buildings, labeled silence, authority, and fear. At the bottom, written in bold letters, were the words, "We all knew. We just waited." The phrase pierced deeper than any accusation could. It stripped away excuses. It dismantled the illusion of ignorance. Everyone in the town at some level had known about the targeting, the suspensions, the violence hidden in files. And everyone, in their own way, had waited for someone else to speak first. The mural declared that waiting was over. When the mural was unveiled during a school assembly, the gym went quiet. Students stared, some nodding, some holding back tears. Parents who had been invited shifted uncomfortably, confronted with the undeniable truth painted by their children. Even teachers stood silently, realizing they too had been painted into the accusation. Photos of the mural traveled fast. National media outlets ran features on it. Commentators debated its meaning, but for the students who painted it, the meaning was simple: acknowledgement. No more hiding behind not knowing, no more pretending surprise. The mural was their declaration of truth, and once painted, it could never be taken back. Lorraine visited the gym a few days later. She stood before the mural with Jasmine at her side, both staring at the silhouettes. Jasmine whispered, "They painted us too." Lorraine placed her arm around her daughter and nodded. Yes, and they painted themselves. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe this resistance was not just survival, it was transformation. The police department tried to downplay it, claiming the mural was inflammatory, but their words sounded hollow against the image of children painting their truth with their own hands. Reporters, activists, and even ordinary citizens who had once been afraid to speak now quoted the mural's haunting words, "We all knew, we just waited." In that phrase, guilt and courage coexisted. It was an indictment and a promise. The past was marked by waiting. The future would be marked by refusal. Refusal to remain silent, refusal to permit violence, refusal to let another generation be taught submission instead of thought. The season of viral resistance was not polished, not orderly, not led by politicians. It was raw, painted in rust, in chalk, in fabric, and in walls. It was born not from strategy but from survival. And in every rusting badge, every t-shirt, every chalkboard farewell, every mural stroke, the message spread wider. Resistance would not wait any longer. The hospital room was quiet, machines humming softly in the background, a faint antiseptic smell filling the air. Lorraine sat by the bed, her hands wrapped around her daughter's pale fingers. For days, she had watched Jasmine's chest rise and fall with the help of wires and monitors, whispering words into the silence, refusing to believe the stillness could last forever. Then, on a morning that broke with thin light through the blinds, Jasmine's eyelids fluttered. At first, it was just a tremor, a flicker, the barest hint of awakening. Lorraine leaned forward, afraid to breathe, afraid to disrupt the fragile thread pulling her daughter back. Slowly, Jasmine's eyes opened. Her gaze was unfocused, caught between dream and reality, but then it settled on Lorraine's face. A weak, hoarse sound escaped her lips, not quite a word, but enough. Lorraine's throat tightened as tears filled her eyes. She pressed her forehead against Jasmine's hand, whispering through the tremor of relief, "I didn't wait. I went first, now you catch up with me." Jasmine blinked slowly, her lips curving into the faintest smile, one corner lifting as though she understood, as though she had been listening all along. In that moment, the years of fear and silence cracked. Lorraine had carried her daughter's voice while Jasmine lay in stillness, shouting when Jasmine could not, standing when she could not rise. Now, as the girl stirred, Lorraine felt something shift. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was continuation. Doctors entered, startled by the sudden return, rushing to check vitals, their clinical words filling the room. But Lorraine barely heard them. All she saw was her daughter, alive, awake, and present. She brushed Jasmine's hair back from her face and whispered again, softer now, "You're not just my child anymore. You're the echo of everything we've fought for." Word spread quickly beyond the hospital walls. News reports carried updates, students shared posts, and within hours, the entire district seemed to be holding its breath. They had marched, painted, written, and resisted, but none of it felt complete without Jasmine's return. Her awakening was more than medical. It was symbolic. The child they tried to silence had opened her eyes again. And with that, the movement felt whole. 2 days later, when Jasmine was strong enough to leave her bed, the hospital became a stage for something no one had planned, but everyone seemed to know would happen. As Lorraine guided her daughter through the sterile hallways, they turned a corner and stopped in shock. Students lined the walls, shoulder to shoulder, silent as stone. No chants, no shouting, no clapping, just presence. They stood in hoodies, jackets, and t-shirts, their faces solemn but unbroken. Each carried a quiet determination, as though their very stillness was louder than any noise they could make. As Jasmine walked slowly, leaning slightly on her mother, she saw the hoodies. Printed across the fabric, bold against the cotton, were words she had never imagined seeing. Not just my mother's child, I'm her echo. The phrase repeated down the hall, a sea of black hoodies with white letters, each one a vow. Jasmine stopped walking, tears welling in her eyes. She tried to speak, but no words came. The silence of the students held her steady. They weren't here to ask for speeches. They weren't here to demand anything from her. They were here to give her back her own strength. Lorraine held her daughter's arm tighter, whispering, "See, you don't walk out of this hospital alone. You carry all of them with you." Doctors and nurses stood aside, some visibly moved, some recording the moment on their phones. The line of students stretched all the way to the exit, forming an honor guard of silence. When Jasmine finally reached the doors, the sunlight pouring in felt different. It wasn't just the warmth of morning. It was the light of a community refusing to bow. Outside, cameras clicked, but even the press seemed subdued by the weight of the moment. A reporter tried to call Jasmine's name, but another journalist hushed them. This was not for headlines. This was for memory. As Jasmine stepped into the air, she whispered to her mother, "I don't feel like myself yet." Lorraine smiled through tears. "That's all right. You don't have to feel like yourself. You are more now." Later, when videos of the silent honor guard went viral, commentators struggled to describe it. They called it reverent, defiant, haunting, but students who were there explained it simply. We stood because she stood for us. The sight of teenagers standing shoulder to shoulder in silence, echoing words that linked mother and daughter, was more powerful than any chant, louder than any crowd. It said without saying, Jasmine had returned, and with her return, the fight was not only alive but unstoppable. A week later, Jasmine sat at a roundtable discussion hosted by a local paper. Reporters, community leaders, and even some teachers filled the room, eager to hear her speak. She was still pale, her body weak, but her voice carried more strength than anyone expected. One reporter leaned forward with the question everyone had been waiting for. "Jasmine, if you could say something directly to the officer who attacked you, what would it be?" The room grew still, cameras angled toward her, pens poised. Jasmine didn't answer immediately. She looked down at her hands, then up again with calm in her eyes. Her reply was steady, almost soft, but it cut like glass. "Nothing. He's no longer on the floor I stand on." The words sank into the silence, rearranging the air itself. Reporters glanced at each other, uncertain whether to press further. Jasmine had given them an answer, but it was not the answer they expected. It wasn't confrontation, it wasn't forgiveness, it was dismissal. By refusing to speak to him, she stripped him of significance. He wasn't worth her words, not worth her time, not worth her breath. The floor she stood on was higher, cleaner, free of his presence. And in that refusal, she reclaimed more power than any accusation could have. Lorraine, sitting beside her, watched with pride. She had spoken for her daughter when Jasmine couldn't. Now Jasmine was speaking not just for herself, but for all who had been pushed down, and she was doing it with silence as her sharpest weapon. The next day, students across the district launched what they called a silent uprising. At noon, in classrooms, cafeterias, gyms, and hallways, thousands of students stood in silence for 1 full minute. Teachers tried to carry on with lessons, but their words fell into the hush. Pens dropped, keyboards stilled, voices faded. For 60 seconds, the entire district paused. When the minute ended, The students sat down again, as if nothing had happened. But the chalkboards told a different story. Across schools, written in hurried chalk, were the words, "Some voices shake walls, even in a whisper." Photos of the chalkboards circulated online, paired with videos of the silent uprising. Commentators called it the most disciplined act of resistance yet. Parents were stunned by the coordination, by the refusal to shout and instead choosing stillness as a weapon. Jasmine watched from home, a blanket over her shoulders, her mother beside her. When she saw the chalkboards, she whispered, "They whisper because I whispered." Lorraine kissed her forehead and replied, "And they roar because you opened your eyes." The uprising was not noisy, not violent, not disruptive in the ways authorities feared, but it was undeniable. It was a reminder that whispers, when shared by many, could shake the ground under the most powerful institutions. Jasmine's return had sparked something deeper, the knowledge that even silence, when chosen, could be louder than oppression. For the first time, Jasmine no longer felt like a victim waking in a hospital bed. She felt like an echo carried by hundreds, perhaps thousands. And as the silent uprising spread beyond her town to other schools and districts, her whisper became a tremor felt far beyond the walls of her home. The first signs that Jasmine's return was no longer just a family story, no longer even just a school story, came in the smallest of rituals. Parents, weary from years of tension with the district, began reshaping the way their community gathered. At the end of every PTA meeting, instead of closing with logistical reminders or fundraising announcements, they stood together. One parent would speak aloud, "No one goes unseen," and the others, sometimes a dozen, sometimes 50, would echo the line back in unison. The phrase was not chosen by committee, not written into a charter. It rose organically, almost accidentally, during one heated meeting when a mother spoke through tears about her son's suspensions. She had ended her speech with the words, "I just want to know that no one goes unseen." Silence had followed. Then, as if to hold her up, the rest of the room repeated her words, softly, then louder, until it became the natural benediction of every meeting thereafter. Even morning announcements at schools began to shift. Teachers and administrators resisted at first, insisting that announcements were for scheduling, weather, lunch menus, and standardized test dates. But students pressed until the last sentence of every announcement now ended with memorial names. Some mornings the list was short, only one or two names, of local students suspended or pushed out of classrooms for challenging authority. Other mornings the list stretched, echoing names from across the country. Young people lost to violence, detention, or silence. The names did not come with explanations. They stood alone, a roll call that reminded everyone listening that their community stretched beyond their walls. It unsettled some teachers. Parents complained that it was too heavy for mornings, but the students insisted, and eventually even the reluctant voices grew quiet in the face of the ritual. "You can't erase the names," one student explained to a reporter. "You can only choose whether to hear them." The rituals bled into churches, barber shops, and kitchen tables. A pastor closed his sermon with the line, "No one goes unseen," and the congregation repeated it. A group of hairdressers taped a handwritten note near their mirrors with the phrase, "Children wrote it in chalk on sidewalks." The repetition was not loud, not militant, but it spread with a persistence impossible to contain. What began as a mother's desperate plea had become the chorus of a whole community, and each time the phrase was spoken, people remembered why it mattered. Each voice, no matter how small, became another brick in the wall of memory. And in that steady building, Jasmine and Lorraine saw their private grief transformed into public ritual. The rituals were not the only ways the community chose to remember. Physical artifacts began to take on meaning. Objects that might otherwise have been forgotten or repaired became monuments. In the high school gym, the dent in the bleachers where Jasmine's body had struck during the officer's assault remained unrepaired. The district wanted to fix it, eager to erase the scar. But students fought back. They signed petitions, staged sit-ins, and threatened to boycott games until the dent was left as it was. "That's not damage," one student told the school board. "That's evidence." Months later, when outsiders visited the school, students would take them to the gym, guiding their hands to the cool metal dip in the bleachers. Some whispered the story, others let the silence explain. The dent had become a touchstone, not of violence alone, but of survival, a scar deliberately preserved. Beyond the school, a small local museum curated an exhibit titled "Where Silence Hit Hardest." At first, it seemed unlikely that a modest community museum could hold national attention, but the exhibit struck a chord. It displayed hoodies with the slogans that had spread through the movement, chalkboards filled with quotes from the silent uprising, and photographs of students lined in hospital hallways. In one glass case sat the rain-corroded badge left outside by students. Its once shiny metal was now streaked with green rust, the surface cracked and brittle. A placard beneath it read simply, "Time tells truth." The exhibit was haunting, but it was also alive. Visitors left notes in journals provided by the museum, scribbling reflections and prayers. Teachers brought classrooms of children who traced the photographs with their fingers, absorbing the story without textbooks. National reporters visited, writing pieces not just about the objects, but about the way the community refused to let them fade. What startled officials most was how willingly people treated these objects not as remnants of pain, but as artifacts of accountability. They were not pitied, they were preserved. They stood as daily reminders that silence had consequences and that memory was its sharpest counterweight. When Lorraine walked through the exhibit with Jasmine at her side, she stopped longest at the badge. She touched the glass gently and said, "He thought it was power. Now it's just rust." Jasmine leaned into her mother's shoulder, whispering, "And rust spreads too." The echo was clear. What corrodes authority also corrodes silence. The gym dent and the museum exhibit became anchors. They rooted the community's grief and defiance in tangible form, forcing everyone to reckon with what had been done and what had grown from it. They were proof that history lived not just in books, but in the scars we refuse to repair. From memory came protest, and the protests took on strange and unexpected forms. Families who once sat quietly in courtrooms began to stage what became known as the protest of absence. Whenever police officers were called to testify, entire families stood, gathered their belongings, and walked out. They did not chant, they did not disrupt, they left their absence in the air like a weight. Court officials begged them to stop, warning that it would hurt cases, but the families continued. To them, the absence said what words could not. They would no longer sit still while the system paraded the same uniforms into rooms, built to silence their children. Students followed suit. In classrooms, whenever a teacher posed hypotheticals about discipline or law, they refused to participate. A history teacher might ask, "What should happen if a student refuses an order from an officer?" And the room would fall into stillness. Hands that usually shot up in discussion now rested on desks. The refusal was complete, absolute. Some teachers were frustrated, accusing the students of derailing lessons, but others began to understand. The refusal was itself a lesson, a living curriculum about the cost of silence and complicity. "We are not hypotheticals," one student explained in a written response. "We are consequences." Outside schools and courts, graffiti began to appear on walls, underpasses, and even sidewalks. The words were simple but chilling. "Some ghosts walk upright." The first instance appeared overnight on the wall of the police precinct. Officers rushed to cover it with paint, but by the end of the week, the phrase appeared across the district. It wasn't just vandalism, it was message. The phrase unsettled many. Parents whispered about its meaning, pastors debated it in sermons, and local officials condemned it. But students explained it plainly. The ghosts were those the system thought buried, silenced, erased, forgotten. But here they were, walking in daylight, carrying their memory as living protest. Jasmine saw the graffiti from a car window one morning. She stared at the letters as they blurred past and said softly, "They're right. We're the ghosts, We just didn't stay down." Lorraine squeezed her hand and replied, "Ghosts don't always haunt, sometimes they guide." By the time spring arrived, the echo of the movement had grown into something the town could not contain. Rituals, artifacts, protests, and whispers wove together into a living fabric of defiance. No one person led it, no organization controlled it. It moved on its own rhythm, unpredictable and unyielding. The officer who struck Jasmine had long since been removed from his post, but his absence did not stop the spread. If anything, it accelerated it. Because the community had realized something larger. This was not about one officer, or one night, or even one family. This was about silence itself. About the way it had been used to cover wounds and protect power, and now silence had been stolen, reshaped, and hurled back as weapon. The echo spread, and with it the understanding that once you teach a community to whisper together, there is no wall high enough, no badge strong enough to silence the sound. Lorraine slipped out of the public eye slowly, the way a tide recedes after a storm. There was no official announcement, no dramatic farewell, no conference where she declared her withdrawal. One day she was present, standing at vigils and attending school forums, and the next she was absent, her chair empty but her name still whispered. At first people wondered if exhaustion had claimed her, if the years of carrying memory had finally bent her shoulders too low. But weeks later she was spotted at the farmer's market, standing near a stall of peaches, her hands brushing over fruit as if she were weighing not just their ripeness, but the pace of her own return to ordinary life. A journalist recognized her and approached, notebook already open, questions spilling out too quickly. Lorraine raised her hand gently, stopping the words. "Do you hear it?" she asked. The journalist paused, confused. Around them the market bustled with chatter, with vendors calling out prices, with children laughing. "Do you hear it?" she asked again, softer this time. The reporter leaned in, uncertain. Lorraine smiled faintly and said, "The silence. It's full of answers." Then she placed 2 peaches into her bag, paid the vendor, and walked away. The story appeared in the paper the next morning, stripped down to those few sentences. Readers argued over its meaning. Some thought she meant she had grown weary of speaking, that silence was her retreat. Others insisted it was her final lesson, that silence itself, reclaimed and redefined, could be louder than any rally. People quoted the line in church bulletins, scrawled it on protest signs, even printed it on t-shirts. "The silence is full of answers" became the last fragment of her public voice, a reminder that stepping back did not mean vanishing. In truth, Lorraine had chosen deliberately. She had given years of her life to amplifying others, to carrying memory into rooms that would have preferred she stayed home. But she knew the work was not hers alone to finish. She wanted Jasmine and her peers to inherit not a burden, but a foundation. So she left the stage, not out of surrender, but out of faith. Faith that the echo no longer needed her breath to carry it forward. Faith that silence could now speak for itself, reshaped and charged with meaning. When neighbors passed her at the market, they no longer asked when she would return to podiums. They asked about recipes, gardens, grandchildren, and in her eyes there was relief. For the first time in years, she was allowed to be Lorraine again. Not the symbol, not the widow, not the mother of the scarred child, but simply a woman choosing fruit for her table. Yet even in her quiet, she remained present. People said you could still feel her words hovering near, like a hymn sung once and still vibrating in the walls long after the choir had departed. Months after Lorraine's quiet retreat, she was invited to guest speak at a law school. She hesitated before accepting, wary of stepping back into the sphere she had left. But the invitation came not from professors or administrators, but from students. They had studied the case, examined the rituals, and felt compelled to hear from the woman who had carried silence into sound. Lorraine agreed, though she insisted she would not lecture, only converse. When she arrived, the lecture hall was packed beyond capacity. Students lined the aisles, sat cross-legged on the floor, even pressed against the walls. There was no grand introduction, no pomp. Lorraine walked to the podium, set her notes down, and then pushed them aside. She began by asking the students what they had heard of her story. Hands rose. Voices spoke of court records, news reports, community testimonies. They listed facts, dates, and precedents. Lorraine listened patiently, nodding at each recitation. Then she said, "And who told you those stories?" The room grew quiet. The students shifted, realizing the trap. She smiled, not unkindly, and said, "Facts come from files, but files do not breathe. Stories breathe, and what you believe depends on which breath you allow in your lungs." For the next hour, she spoke not of the assault, not of the courtroom, not even of her own speeches. She spoke of listening, of how silence had once been the weapon wielded against her family, how absence had been a cage, and how she had learned to transform silence into testimony. She spoke of memory as a form of resistance, of rituals as living laws, of names as precedents etched deeper than any statute. At the end, a young student, clearly nervous, raised her hand and asked, "Who are you, really? I mean, beyond what they say, beyond what we've read, who are you?" Lorraine paused, tilted her head, and then answered with a smile, "Just someone who stayed awake longer than most." The room erupted in quiet laughter, then applause, then silence again. The kind of silence that filled space with reverence, not absence. The students left with notebooks full of scribbles, but hearts carrying something heavier. For years afterward, alumni quoted that line in interviews, graduation speeches, and even legal arguments. Someone who stayed awake longer than most became shorthand for refusing complacency, for choosing vigilance in a world eager to lull people back into ignorance. Lorraine returned home that evening not to headlines, but to her garden. She clipped herbs, watered soil, and sat in her chair with tea. The words she had spoken were already out of her hands, already traveling further than she could follow. She did not need to chase them. She had given what she had, and now it belonged to others. While Lorraine's words continued to echo in lecture halls and courtrooms, Jasmine's path was taking shape. She no longer saw herself only as the daughter of her mother's struggle. She had stepped into her own light, not just surviving the trauma of the officer's assault, but transforming it into fuel. At 17, she convened a youth forum in the high school auditorium. It was not an official school event, though students, teachers, and parents crowded in. The banners were handmade, the microphones borrowed, the programs photocopied on classroom printers. But the room vibrated with energy. Jasmine stood on stage, still thin from recovery but steady, her voice clear. She told her story not as a victim, but as a witness. She reminded her peers that they had stood in hospital hallways, that they had refused hypotheticals, that they had whispered together until the walls themselves quaked. At one point, a student asked what came next. Jasmine did not hesitate. She leaned forward and declared, "We're not echoes anymore, we're the storm." The words hung heavy, like thunder just before it cracks open the sky. The crowd erupted, not in cheers but in a collective exhale of recognition. They had waited for someone to give shape to what they already felt stirring within them. From that moment, the forum shifted. Students began proposing projects, mentorship circles, art exhibits, scholarship funds named after those lost. Teachers offered resources, parents pledged support. It was as if the whole community had been waiting for Jasmine to give permission to believe they were more than reflections, more than survivors. They were architects of what came next. Lorraine watched from the back row. She did not speak, did not wave, did not intervene. But tears slid silently down her cheeks as she realized that her daughter had crossed the threshold. The burden was no longer hers alone to carry. Jasmine had become the storm, and storms do not whisper, they roar. By the time the forum ended, plans were already in motion. Students scheduled follow-up meetings, committees formed, and new slogans appeared on hoodies. But Jasmine did not stay for the celebrations. She slipped out quietly, finding her mother waiting in the hallway. For a long moment, they simply held hands. No words were exchanged because none were needed. The echo had become its own thunder. The closing image of the story was not in a courtroom, not in a protest, not even in a forum. It was in the hallway of the same school where silence had once been a weapon. A young black student no older than 12 paused at the dented wall. His hand traced the uneven metal, the scar left when Jasmine's body had slammed against it. He did not flinch, did not cry. Instead, he stood taller, his chin lifting, as though the dent had taught him posture. Nearby, a teacher watched quietly. The boy did not notice. He simply whispered something under his breath, too soft to catch, and then walked down the hall with his head high. The dent remained, not as a reminder of violence, but as a compass pointing forward. A voice seemed to hover in the space, not tied to any single speaker, but carried by memory itself. She's not here anymore, but every time a child lifts their chin without being struck down, that's when she returns. The hallway fell silent again, but it was the kind of silence Lorraine had spoken of, the silence full of answers. It was not absence, it was presence. It was proof that even when voices fall quiet, even when mothers step back into gardens and daughters move into storms, the legacy endures. Years later, people would still tell the story. They would still repeat the phrases, "No one goes unseen," "Some ghosts walk upright," "We're not echoes anymore." And in each retelling, the silence hummed louder, for silence, once reshaped, does not return to its cage. It lingers, it instructs, it guards. Lorraine lived the rest of her life in quiet dignity, her presence occasionally glimpsed at markets, at parks, at small-town events. Jasmine carried the storm forward, her leadership branching into national youth movements, yet both women remained tethered to that dent in the wall, that scar in the bleachers, that whisper in the courtroom. Their legacy was not bound to titles, offices, or accolades. It was bound to silence itself. Once their oppressor, now their inheritance. The story did not end because the silence never ended. It carried itself forward, from mother to daughter, from daughter to peers, from peers to strangers, until it became impossible to separate where one voice ended and another began. Silence had become the chorus, and in that chorus, every child, every parent, every witness could hear not just grief, but possibility. And so the final image rests not in mourning, but in resilience. A dented wall, a lifted chin, a silence that speaks. The storm continues, not in rage alone, but in memory, in ritual, in every small act of defiance that declares, "No one goes unseen."